Okay, good morning everybody and welcome to this morning's webinar. My name is Els and I'm the webinar moderator of today. Today's webinar will be about the do's and don'ts of drafting medical devices harmonized standards. Now before we start, let me tell you that you are all muted today, so you do not have the possibility to speak, but you can enter your questions in the question panel on the GoToWebinar interface. So please do so by writing your questions there. The speakers will answer your questions after the presentation. So, please let me introduce you first my colleague Katarina Kokeshova, who is here Project Manager at the CENELEC Management Center, and who will maybe also introduce the other speakers.
Good morning, thank you, Els. So today I will be joined by Tony Wilkes, who is the new approach consultant for medical devices. Tony is joining from his office at home, so I hope that everything will go smoothly. And here in Brussels, I'm joined by Agnieszka Mielczarek, who is working as policy officer at the European Commission DG GROW.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning from Scotland as well.
Perfect. So to take you through the content of this morning's webinar, I will shortly introduce you to the state of play of harmonized standards. And then Tony will take you through the template for Annex Z, also best practices and some tips for developing the Annex ZA and ZZ. Agnieszka will then take over and talk to you about normative references, other tips for drafting standards, and also provide you with some information on the transition period. And we will wrap up with some key lessons learned and question and answers session. So just to start with some statistics for all the published candidate harmonized standards for the three directives, Medical Devices Directive, IVD, and AIMD. As you can see, there are around 244 published standards for the Medical Device Directive, out of which 210 have been cited and 34 are awaiting citation. This number is slightly different for the IVD, where we have 47 published standards, 44 cited in the official journal, and 3 awaiting citation. And for AIMD, there are 54 published standards, 48 cited, and 6 awaiting citation. The number of published standards, just to note, doesn't include those that have been already rejected by the Commission. The latest publication of references in the OJU took place on the 17th of November 2017. In this publication, 10 standards were cited and 74 were rejected with justifications provided by the Commission. Some of the reasons for non-citation was that many of the standards were without an Annex Z or with a wrong format used for the Annex Z. There have been also several issues with referencing identified. For example, that the presumption of conformity was claimed by reference to another standard, many occurrences of undated normative references, or normative references to informative documents. And as such, we thought that it would be good to provide some guidance, also in view of the transition to the regulation. Some guidance already exists, which is provided by the European Commission, for example, in the Blue Guide or in the Vademecum. But today we really want to look into the practical side of drafting standards and also the Annex Z, which is why I will now give the floor to Tony, who will provide you with more information on the Annex Z.
Well, good morning, everybody from Edinburgh in Scotland. I hope the technology is going to work. Before we get on to the template for the Annex ZAs for the new MDR and IVDR, I thought it'd be useful to go back to see what the Annex ZAs used to look like a few years ago before the formal objections from the EC. So this is an example which I've sort of just picked at random, which is EN ISO 7376 on anaesthetic and respiratory equipment laryngoscopes for tracheal intubation. Next slide, please. So this is the table ZA from the Annex ZA for that standard. And you can see that the clauses, subclauses are listed on the left-hand side with the essential requirements from the Medical Devices Directive in the middle column. Next slide. And you can see here that the essential requirements, sorry, if we could go back just a stage, you can see that the essential requirements are listed more than once in the middle column. So for example, I've highlighted essential requirement 7.1, which is listed 4 times that I've circled, and I've actually missed one there, I can see as well. So 7.1 is listed at least 5 times, and that's just part of table ZA1. There is actually more than that. Next slide, please. If we look at essential requirement 7.1 of the Medical Devices Directive, you can see it's actually quite a complex essential requirement made up of many separate parts. So the other question here is which part of essential requirement 7.1 is claimed to be covered by those particular clauses and subclauses listed in table ZA1. Next slide, please. So in that particular example, and that wasn't that unusual at the time in 2009, you can see that the subclauses listed in the left-hand column, the essential requirements are in the middle column, and the ERs are listed multiple times. Are they covered completely or partially? We don't know. And part of the reason for not knowing that is that the column for comments wasn't used on the right-hand side of that table either. Next slide, please. So when we came to looking at the new format for the Annex ZAs, following the formal objections and rejections of citations of standards in the official journal by the European Commission, there was a BT decision in 2015 which gave some background for the new templates, and also then in a later BT decision, which was 41/2015, also included then the templates for the MDD, the In Vitro Diagnostic Medical Devices Directive, and the Active Implantable Medical Devices Directive. This also included changes to the European Forward for listing dated normative references, which are included in the ISO parts or IEC parts of standards. Now, as many annexes ZA and ZZ as needed should be included in the standards. Next slide, please. So this is what the template currently looks like for the Medical Devices Directive 9342 EEC. So this is the opening couple of paragraphs and the standard text to go in the Annex ZA. And you can see that the reference to the standardization request should be explicitly stated in the first paragraph. Next slide, please. The notes are important here as well. In terms of the text that's used about reducing risks, you have to look up to see what the essential requirements say in the particular essential requirements and how that reflects the reduction of risks in the clauses of the standard. Note 3 is important because it says about linking the coverage with the table of references in the European Forward, and we'll come on to that in a little bit later. Next slide, please. And this is what the table ZA1 of the Annex ZA should look like, with the essential requirements listed in the left-hand side and ordered in order of the essential requirements, and the clauses and subclauses of the European standard then listed in the middle column. The remarks notes in the right-hand column should be used to indicate any limitations of the coverage of the essential requirements. Next slide, please. So in terms of the European Forward, if it's a European standard that's based on an ISO or an IEC standard, the normative references listed in the ISO or IEC standards might not be dated. But to be cited in the official journal, all the normative references in the European version have to be dated. So there is a table that should be included in the European Forward, which should list all the dated references of the European versions of the ISO and IEC standards. So the Annex ZA is used in EN standards based on the ISO standards, and the Annex ZZ then refers to the Annex ZA in the IEC standards, which are based then for the EN standards. So if you remember note 3 in the Annex ZA for ISO standards, this Annex ZA is based on normative references according to the table of references in the European Forward, replacing the references in the core text. They need to be dated. So next slide, please. So this is the text that's then added to the European Forward. And what's important here is that there's a reminder that the user should always check that any reference document has not been superseded and that its relevant contents can still be considered the generally acknowledged state of the art. So even when dated normative references are used, the user should always check that they haven't been superseded by a further version or edition. Next slide, please. And this is what the table looks like. This is the example that was given in the template for the Annex ZA for the MDD. You can see that the undated normative references are listed on the left-hand side from the ISO standard, and the equivalent dated standards are then listed in the middle and right-hand columns of the table. So an example of this Annex ZA, which has been accepted by the European Commission and was included in the official journal when it was the latest list was published in November last year, was the EN ISO 10328 on prosthetics. So if we could just have a look at that table ZA from the Annex ZA for that standard, you can see it's a very short list of essential requirements that are claimed to be covered, which are listed down the left-hand side. The clauses, sub-clauses of the European standard are listed in the middle column, and the remarks and notes on the right-hand column are used to cover, to indicate where the limitations of cover are. So you can see we've got respect to use in combination with other devices or equipment, with respect to any restrictions, etc. Next slide, please. So when we came to draft the new template for the Annex ZA for the MDR and the IVDR, we really based it on the same format as had been used previously. But for the template, I also included the link with the machinery directive, which wasn't included in the original template for the MDD. And that link with the machinery directive is also needed for the IVDR as well. It wasn't included in the in vitro medical diagnostic directive before. Again, the notes are an essential part of the Annex ZA, as with the MDD. And there should be, again, an explicit link to the relevant standardization request when it's published by the European Commission. And that's being worked on, as I understand, at the moment. And don't forget to add the table of correlation of normative references to the European Forward if it's required. Next slide, please. So this is the proposal for the new Annex ZA template for the MDR. Again, we need the explicit reference to the standardization request when that's published. Next slide, please. And then the notes are very similar to what was included in the previous template, except that the essential requirements now are replaced by the general safety and performance requirements of the medical devices regulation. So the numbering has changed, and also some of the text has changed, particularly in note 1, about reduction of risks. So that needs to be kept in mind when looking at the standard and how those risks are reduced according to the standard, and how those reflect the language that's used in the regulations itself. And again, we've got the note 3 about the reference to the table of correlation of the European standards, dated standards in the European Forward. Next slide, please. So again, this is what the table ZA1 looks like, identical format to before. Next slide, please. And then if required, there is then also the link with the machinery directive, which needs to be added in. And if this is added in, there is then a separate table, ZA2, to link the essential health and safety requirements of the machinery directive with the clauses of this standard. Next slide, please. So this is what table ZA2 would look like if it was added in and is necessary for this for the standard. Again, we have the essential health and safety requirements of the machinery directive in the left-hand column, clauses, sub-clauses of the standard in the middle column, and any remarks or notes to specify limits of coverage of the particular health and safety requirements in the right-hand column. Next slide, please. So when completing the Annex ZA, as has already been mentioned, the general safety and performance requirements should be listed in the left-hand column, and they should be ordered in rows in GSPRs. Where necessary or appropriate, the GSPR should be split into the individual indents or parts. For example, 19.1 consists of parts A, B, and C also has 4 separate indents. So those might need to be mentioned separately, listed separately, so that the actual coverage can be identified. You might even need to go down to the separate sentences or phrases of the GSPRs. The relevant clauses, sub-clauses are then added to the middle column, and the extent of the coverage described in the right-hand column. For example, you might use text similar to covered in respect of to show the limitation of the coverage of the GSPR. Next slide, please. So when completing the Annex ZA, it's important to remember just a few tips here. If coverage is only provided by a normative reference to another standard, don't claim presumption of conformity, POC, in the referring standard. Only make that presumption of conformity claim in the standard that's been referred to. Ensure that the subtle priority order of, for example, the labeling and instructions for use, general safety performance requirements are respected. Provide the reference to specific clauses, sub-clauses that provide the coverage of the GSPRs rather than whole sections of the standard. This is one of the things that's been used in the past, where the whole standard was claimed to cover a GSPR, an essential requirement, and really you need to narrow that down to the actual clauses or sub-clauses that provide the coverage or claim to provide the coverage. The pass-fail criteria are encouraged to show the limitations and how risks can be reduced, but test methods on their own cannot provide coverage, as the test method on its own cannot reduce the risk. Next slide, please. I think Agnieszka, this is over to you.
Thank you very much, Tony, for guiding us through the Annex Z issues. I'll now take over and I will speak first about referencing and then about other reoccurring issues when it comes to drafting standards. And as you will see, many of those issues actually link to what Tony has already presented to us, because indeed the content and the annex are sort of a tandem. So first, just a sort of a general reflection. And for an introduction, I think that referencing is one of the most challenging and difficult issues with regard to drafting standards, simply because of reference chains and the possibilities that standardizers have, let's say, in managing and controlling the references. Now, also just to start, we should make a distinction between normative references and informative references. Informative references, this is something very simple. We basically give a guidance to a reader, to a user, where something can be found. Whereas normative references have a much bigger impact, because by making a reference, a normative reference, we actually intend to include the referred standard or its part as part of our standard. So we intend to give some sort of legal effect into it. Now, when we look at the slide, it shows basically a bit of how the reference chain can flow. So we have a referring standard, which can then refer either to a harmonized standard, it can refer to a European standard, or it can refer to an international standard. And then, in turn, each of those referred standards can include further references, again, to different types of standards, and those references can have different scope. Sometimes the reference can be very, very specific, but sometimes it can go very, very, very broadly and catch, let's say, a whole family of standards. And as I have just said, by making the reference, we intend to give a legal effect as far as the reference chain reaches. So not only to the, let's say, first step, but even farther. And this is why we have to be careful about what we are actually catching. Now, for some basic rules regarding, or some general rules, anyone who has been involved with this will see that very often it will be a little bit case-by-case assessment and in trying to find the right solution. But when now trying to present some general rules, I would say that, first of all, the referring standard should, the intention should be that the reference standard should not replace the referring standard, but complement it. So when making a claim of presumption of conformity by a certain clause of the referring standard, we should not limit ourselves just to a simple reference. We should not say that this specific requirement is actually addressed by another standard, because in this way we are not actually providing any added value with our standard. So the reference should be just ancillary, and it should be complementary to our standard. The reference should be clear and precise. If we refer to something else, we should make clear what the scope of this reference is. So which parameter, which value, which requirement specifically are we intending to catch by the reference? We should not just make a general statement saying, well, for requirements on I don't know, electromagnetic compatibility, please use, and here we can, I don't know, refer to a family of standards. That is not specific enough. Then whatever we refer to should be also clear and precise. So again, it should not be a sort of catch-all general clause. If it's to complement the referring standard, it has to be specific. As a general rule, also, whatever we refer to must be included within the mandate of the Commission. If we refer to standards which, let's say, are outside of the scope of a medical device legislation, then it is not really to serve the compliance with that legislation. So perhaps that reference should remain informative rather than a normative one. As Tony has mentioned, it's very, very important, and this is why the slide shows it on green, to include in the foreword a correspondence table which will list all the references and indicate the European correspondence, and also all those standards have to be dated once. Also, you have to make sure that the references are the latest, that the standards which are referred to are the latest versions, so that they correspond with the state of the art. And finally, the references must be to standards which have a normative value, and that these are not some sort of a different types of documents or acts, such as standards of other jurisdictions, scientific guidelines, or something else. When referring to standards, this is something which links to my previous comment, but when making a reference to a part of a standard, we should also make sure that that part has a normative value, that it's not, let's say, an informative annex. And in general, we should try to avoid uncontrolled, contradictory, or unmanageable reference chains. And this, through experience, shows to be a sort of a main challenge that, especially with the standards drafted in the past, sometimes the reference chains are very broad. There are references to families of standards, and this is very, very difficult then to remedy. And in general, of course, the wider the scope of the references, then the higher is likelihood for problems, basically. If possible, some, let's say, minor issues or simpler issues can be remedied by making remarks or notes in the right-hand column of Annex Z, such as to, for example, mention that for certain reference, the presumption of conformity cannot be guaranteed. However, this way of, let's say, explanatory comments should not be a way to remedy major problems with referencing, but rather, let's say, very specific and minor ones. Now I've tried to present some sort of three constellations when making references. And the first such constellation or a setup would be a normative reference to an entire standard. So we don't specifically mention why or in which context we refer to it, but we refer to the whole standard. If that is a harmonized standard, that is the not right thing to do, because the harmonized standard has its own, let's say, legal validity, its own life, and we should at most make an informative reference. If it's a European norm, that is not recommended either, because that European norm should be subject to, let's say, a separate process for citation in the official journal. So it should be covered by the mandate and then submitted for citation. And that's where the legal effect of that European norm should derive from. Where it's international standard, it's not acceptable even more, because only European norms may become harmonized standards, but not international standards. Now, let's go to another setup. We make a reference to an entire standard, but with regard to specific parameters or conditions. If this is a harmonized standard, that should be okay. If this is a European norm, we should make a case-by-case assessment why this European norm has not become a harmonized standard so far. So again, the logic is that something which is to function as a harmonized standard should go through the normal harmonization process laid down by the regulation, the standardization regulation. If this is an international standard, this cannot be accepted because, again, only European norms may become harmonized standards. Now, the third setup, where a reference to a standard is very specific, where we make a reference in a context of a very specific clause or subclause of the referred standard. And this is actually how the references should look like. And this is where we will encounter the less problems. If it's a harmonized standard, no problem whatsoever. If it's a European norm, again, it should be fine, but we should check that whatever we catch by the reference meets otherwise the criteria for citation in the European journal. if it's in the international standard, I would say we cannot exclude it completely, but it should be case by case assessed and admitted as an exception rather than as a rule. Now, I would like to talk about some other issues which occur when drafting standards, and then also that come to our eyes when we as the Commission are reviewing them. As Tony already has also explained, some essential requirements they are basically they are drafted in a different way. Some of them are very general. Some of them are more specific, but we should not rely just on their numbering, but we have to look more into the real content. And some, as mentioned by Tony 7.1, they have, let's say, different subsets of requirements. So when claiming a presumption of conformity, we have to see which part actually our standard is addressing. And we should specify it, and we should not just rely on, let's say, a thematic link, whether the specific issue is addressed at all, but in how far it is addressed. And the example of Annex Z that Tony has presented, I think reflected it well, because there the right-hand column indeed specified which aspect was addressed for which essential requirement. And that, of course, leads to a conclusion that a specific attention has to be paid to essential requirements which are formulated in a very broad way. Another issue that sometimes appears is that the user should not be given options in how to use the standard. The standard should guide him and tell, well, you have to do A, B, C, D, and not that it's left at his discretion. And also, which is a little bit linked, is that the standard should not really lay down the requirements for third persons. The requirements are for the manufacturer and not for, let's say, other parties. Now, another issue which sometimes comes to our eyes is that if a standard reproduces legal provisions, then make sure that they are reproduced really correctly, such as, for example, the definitions or the labeling rules when it comes to the sequence, when it means, let's say, to cumulative requirements or alternative requirements. And if the standard reproduces legal provisions, it's not really correct to claim that the presumption of conformity is assured through the standard. I mean, if it's just basically a reproduction of the legal provisions, it can be the case for, let's say, different reasons. If there is a standard on packaging, maybe the standardizers want to include a section also on labeling and reproduce some of the provisions of the legislation. But then this sort of reproduction, it doesn't really add any additional value. It's okay, provided that it complies with the European legislation, but then it's, let's say, informative in a way, because in the first place, the user, the manufacturer, has anyway to follow the legal requirements directly. And finally, it sometimes happens that for families of standards, but I would refer here to standards which are at the same level, so like a sister, brother, twin standards. It also happens that annexes Z are reproduced in a sort of an automatic way. Please make sure that really all clauses which are mentioned in Annex Z do exist in that another almost copy-paste standard, because it sometimes happened that a clause which was mentioned in Annex Z did not exist in that standard at all, but rather in the second standard, or the first one, on which the Annex Z was based. Now, sort of a special case regarding a testing method, which was also very, very relevant in the context of referencing. We can imagine three setups, again, three main setups. The first, a sort of ideal one, is when the testing method and limit values are included in one harmonized standard. Then indeed we can, for a specific risk reduction requirement, claim presumption of conformity. We can have another setup where we have a testing method in one harmonized standard, but the limit values are laid down in another standard, which can be, again, a harmonized standard, a European norm, an international standard. Here the answer would be, okay, let's do case-by-case assessment if that limit value is can be accessed in a very specific, clear way, and if otherwise that limit value meets the criteria for otherwise inclusion as part of a harmonized standard, that should not be excluded, but this should be, again, assessed case by case to see if it's really clear and precise and does not lead to any contradictions or question marks for the user. And now we can have a third setup where there is a testing method only without laying down any limit values. Then I would say it's, well, the sort of a risk of problems increases, and it should be case-by-case assessment in how far the testing method, in which way is it actually relevant for a specific essential requirement. Because as such, the testing method alone cannot guarantee a risk reduction, so there is no standalone presumption of conformity for the specific essential requirement. So I think this is all from my side when it comes to, let's say, most frequent points for drafting standards. And I don't know, should we go now to questions, or I should finish with the transition period? All right, yes, Katarina is nodding, so I will finish with some general remarks for the transition period, and then we will be able to go to questions. So the alignment in general will be necessary indeed, and in two contexts. The most important one from the point of view of essential requirements will be indeed to see if the standards which are currently existing need an update and alignment to the new safety and performance requirements laid down in the regulations. A second say direction or a context of this alignment exercise, which I would say is less heavy in terms of let's say, presumption of conformity, but more heavy in terms of administrative burden, is an update of all Annex ZA, because I think in most cases it will at least involve renumbering. So as Tony also explained, when preparing for this alignment and working on standards, two annexes that should be prepared, each referring to the specific legislation at stake, particularly in the transition period when both pieces of legislation may be relevant. However, I would close this with a general statement that the European standards, well, that the harmonized standard is a European standard adopted on the basis of a request made by the Commission. And this is important insofar when it comes to publication of standards and their subsequent citation. And for any citation in the European, in the official journal, it is absolutely necessary that there is a
mandate from the Commission before, and this is what we are indeed currently working on. So this is all from my part, and I will just hand over now to Katarina and Tony.
Yes. So just for the very end, we have prepared for you some key lessons learned that you should take away from today's webinar, even though I'm sure that there might be some more that you have picked up throughout Tony's and Agnieszka's very detailed presentation. The first of them being indeed that the technical committees should use the correct Annex ZA and ZZ template. After this webinar, I will circulate the annexes for the MDR and IVDR so that you know which ones to use. Also, as many annexes ZA and ZZ can be used as the number of directives regulations the standard aims to support. This means you can have an annex for the directive, for the regulation, medical device, IVD, really as many as you need. And then the sequence of the referencing would be Annex ZA, ZB, ZC, etc. It's also important to remember that a harmonized standard does not need to cover all relevant requirements, but the Annex Z must then always be consistent with the real coverage of the essential requirements, of course. You should also include normative references to other standards only as far as necessary, and to complete the referring standard. And the drafters of Annexes Z or ZA should also avoid uncontrolled reference chains. And of course, I would also like to let you know that myself and also your relevant new approach consultant are always here to provide you with any further advice.